common knowledge applies in not just private interactions or small interactions, but also applies to very public interactions. So your setup in chapter one, which I think was really brilliant, because I think uh, it's a bit difficult to kind of do the whole setup of how do we acquire common knowledge, but where you talk about the Super Bowl ads, which is, very in North America at least a very big generator of like what's happening, and whereas we mentioned the joint attention. So with common knowledge, what you've kind of laid out is that it's both something that happens on a very private scale, but also on a very public scale, right?
Yes, and that's an idea that I got from Michael Chue, a political scientist, who wrote a book 20 something years ago, kind of a bit of a predecessor of mine, although not from the point of view of psychology. But he gave the example of how Super Bowl ads are or the Super Bowl is one of our last nationwide common knowledge generators. That is,
Right.
when you're watching the Super Bowl, you know that almost everyone else is watching it, and they know that you're watching it, and so on. And that makes it ideally suited to products that depend on common knowledge. And the example that Troy gave
Hmm.
was the when Apple introduced the Macintosh computer. It was clearly a better machine than the IBM PCs that people were using at the time. The IBM PCs had 24 rows of 80 characters, no graphics. You had to memorize commands. The syntax had to be perfect. You had to remember the name, all the file names of everything you had stored and where you stored them. The Mac was the first affordable computer with Windows icons, menus, and a pointing device, a mouse. But so it was clearly a superior product, but that wasn't Apple's problem. The problem was no one was going to buy this esoteric new technology, a kind of geeky new gadget, which had been used years before in labs like Xerox Palo Alto Research Center until Steve Jobs had the brainchild that he could maybe commercialize it. Uh, the problem that Apple faced was no one wanted to be the only person who owned a Macintosh because then they couldn't be sure that they could buy apps or consumables or peripherals or user groups or repair people. So they had to convey the knowledge, not what an insanely great new computer the Mac was, but everyone is hearing what you're hearing. A lot of other people are going to be tempted to buy the Mac. So the Super Bowl was a way to generate that common knowledge. And what it meant is they didn't have to advertise the product, and they didn't. They hired Ridley Scott, the famous Hollywood director who did Blade Runner and Alien, the most expensive ad in the history of television, which ran exactly once. And it just showed an athletic young woman bursting into a grim corporate board meeting. Conveniently, the year 1984, of course, was the title of the Orwell's dystopian novel. And so they featured a scene out of kind of Orwellian 1984 with this athletic woman bursting in, hammer throwing a mallet at the screen, which then exploded into a fireball, revealing a crawl that said, on January 25th, Apple will introduce the Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. That's all the ad said. Nothing about the product, nothing about the icons, the menus. But what it was advertising was common knowledge, what you're seeing, everyone else is seeing. And Schwer showed that other products that depend on network effects, like a new credit card, where no one would adopt the credit card unless they thought enough merchants would take it. No merchant would take it unless they thought enough customers were to adopt it. Or products that depended on status or prestige or brand loyalty. Uh, Things that don't stand out by the nature of the product, like beer. American beer is kind of all the same. I mean, I don't think you
Yeah.
can difference between Bud and Miller and Coors blindfolded. But for whatever reason, it matters to people whether they're seen as a Bud drinker or a Coors drinker, or a Miller drinker. And so those tend to be advertised in the Super Bowl. But crucially, it's not the size of the audience, but the price per eyeball was greater
Hmm.
on the Super Bowl than other media. And the companies that tend to pay that premium, the Super Bowl premium, are those whose products depend on network effects, on everyone knowing that everyone knows that this product is available.